culture in the 1930s. So how can these questions come up? Well, you could get asked something about popular culture in the 1920s, which is like jazz age, heroes and movie stars, you know, getting the cars, the Model T Ford cars. Or you could get something about the 1930s, which is the one I'm doing now, or the 1950s and 60s, which there is another podcast on. So, during the 1930s then, popular culture was really important because obviously they were experiencing the American Depression. So a lot of people started to read books by John Steinbeck. So they started to read books like The Grapes of Wrath, which was about a group of farmers that were struggling during the Depression and during the Dust Bowl, which I talked about earlier. And also books like Of Mice and Men, which are about two migrant workers going around looking for work. So Steinbeck became really significant and people read his books. The Grapes of Wrath was actually the most popular selling book of the 1930s, and the movie people, Hollywood producers, were really trying to sort of argue over who would produce this as a film. And in the end, that was released in the year 1940. Other films as well you can mention about the 1930s is Gone with the Wind, actually got 10 Academy Awards, that film. And also another one was The Wizard of Oz with Judy Garland in it. So there's plenty of things to be writing about in terms of that. And it was the first time as well in the 1930s where they did films that were like horror films, so like Dracula and Frankenstein, things like that also became really popular. They experienced as well a bit of a boom in the movies in terms of trying to use colour towards the end of the 1930s, so people were interested to see how that would work. Because remember, in the 1930s, people still have not got TVs at home, so they're still relying on going to the movies. It won't surprise you though that the amount of people going to the movies did drop. The reason for this is because people didn't have the money to afford to go to the movies all the time. But still 60 million people, roughly a week, went to the movies, but that was quite a big drop from the 100 million a week that went during the 1920s. Because people who were still fairly well off would still go there to be entertained. Now, don't just talk about the movies though. It's not just about the movies, popular culture, it's about other things that are going on. So anyone who was anyone would have a radio in their front room. They didn't have them in other rooms, it was in the front room and the family would gather around it. And after school there would be little programmes on for the kids on the radio, so things like, you know, Superman, things out of comics, you know, like it's almost a bit like Children's Hour really that people have, you know, nowadays, BBC. But people would listen to those, and there would also be lots of soap operas and things that were on there. And they were called that because the advertisements in between when the story was being told were always about soap suds and things, because they wanted the women who were at home listening to those to buy the latest soap suds that they'd wash the dishes with or clean the clothes with. So radio became really popular. And by the end of the 1930s, in 1939, 84% of homes actually had a radio. So that was quite significant. Most people had access to a radio. Advertisement was huge as well, because now they had the radio to use, the advertisements came thick and fast. So they constantly were advertising things, I say, like soap suds, but there was always like Coca-Cola and River Spearmint gum. All these different companies got in on that because they were really thought it was a good way of getting the message across. Now, stars in the 1930s. Greta Garbo was still popular because obviously she was still gorgeous and everyone still fancied her. But the problem was, when now these movies had a lot of talking in them because you actually had to act, popularity did decline a bit because people actually thought, oh, I'm not sure about her voice, and I'm not sure if she's that good at acting. So there were still people around from the 1920s, but they weren't always as popular. Certainly though, Charlie Chaplin was just as popular with his slapstick comedy, and two other comedians that were really popular were Laurel and Hardy. So these were the ones in the 1930s that people wanted to go and see. Some of their films were silent and some had a bit of talking in them. By the end of the 1930s, they had started to have talking in those. There was also people like Jack Dempsey that was really popular as well. And there was also people as well who were in like the gangster movies, because remember the 1920s was all about the gangsters. So now in in the 1930s, they started to do gangster movies. I'm sure you won't have heard of these, but your parents will have. Westerns. So they used to do a lot of westerns about cowboys and Indians. That was something people were interested in learning about and seeing about. So that was something that was a lot of movies on as well. And some other stars were like Gloria Swanson. She was a famous movie star and seen as a good actress at the time. And Judy Garland, as I mentioned before, and also Mickey Rooney. So there was lots of different people who became famous in the 1930s. And Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney were like seen as the child stars of the 1930s, and if they were in anything, people wanted to, go and see these things that they were in. Finally, it was also an absolute golden age for sport. And the reason why this was is there's the Harlem Globetrotters that were famous worldwide, so everybody wanted to go there. And to encourage people to actually go to the sporting venues, women used to get a free entry because that was so they would bring the families along. So again, it's another golden age of American sport, just like it had really been in the 1920s. So in popular culture, people were listening to the radio, jazz music was still on that, so people like Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, people like that were still famous. People were still going to the movies. Less people had cars though, so it was a little bit harder to get around because obviously some of them had sold them during the Depression. And people still did go to the movies though because they wanted some escapism. They wanted to watch something that took the mind off how bad things were for them on a daily basis. And the final people who were really famous in the 1930s is Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. They did 15 movies together during the 1930s and people flocked to see them. Because they sang songs like Pick Yourself Up, which was obviously, saying pick yourself up out of the Depression. There was other songs like Swing Time, and that was the name of one of the movies. So people constantly wanted to watch them because they just forgot the worries, basically. So during the 1930s, popular culture was still a really important part of America.